For more than 60 years, the world saw Cliff Richard and George Harrison as two separate legends. But only now, at 85, Cliff is finally revealing the quiet bond, the hidden lessons, and the spiritual truth he carried in his heart all his life. A truth about George that no one ever expected. Before Cliff Richard became a British icon, he was simply a boy searching for a place where he truly belonged. And something was about to enter his life that would light a fire the world wouldn't be able to ignore. Cliff was born as Harry Roger Webb in 1940 inches, Lucknow, India, at a time when the country was still under British rule. His early years were simple and peaceful, surrounded by family and a culture that felt warm and familiar. He was too young to understand the political changes happening around him, but everything shifted quickly when India gained independence in 1947. Like many British families living in India at that time, Cliff's family decided to return to England, hoping for stability and a better future. They left everything behind and moved in 1948, when Cliff was only 8 years old. That journey marked the beginning of a major transition in his life. When the Webb family arrived in England, they faced a world that looked and felt completely different from what they had known in India. Post-war Britain was still struggling to rebuild itself after World War II. Houses were damaged, food was limited, jobs were uncertain, and daily life was far from easy. The weather felt colder, the streets were dull, and the mood of the country carried a heavy sense of hardship and recovery. For a young boy who had grown up in a warm, lively environment, this change was confusing and upsetting. Cliff often felt out of place and lonely. He didn't fully understand the cultural differences, and the transition from India to England made him feel like he didn't quite fit in anywhere. His family settled in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, a quiet, working-class area where most people were trying to rebuild their lives. Money was tight, and like many families at the time, the Webbs lived very modestly. Cliff's father worked hard to support them, and his mother kept the home running with whatever little they had. Cliff's teenage years were marked by this struggle, but they were also shaping him, teaching him resilience and patience. School life was ordinary, and he hadn't yet discovered what would eventually change his life. He was simply a shy boy, trying to adjust to a country that felt gray and unfamiliar. Everything changed when Cliff first heard American rock and roll. This happened during his early teens, when he began listening to the radio and exploring records that young people were passing around. The first sounds of artists like Elvis Presley and Little Richard felt like a shock of electricity. The lively beat, the bold voice, the rhythm, and the energy were unlike anything in British music at the time. To Cliff, it felt like a door opening into a new world. It was the first time since leaving India that something made him feel alive, excited, and truly connected. Music became more than a hobby. It became his escape. Whenever he listened to rock and roll, the gray world around him seemed to brighten. As Cliff grew older, he realized that music wasn't just something he enjoyed, it was something he understood deeply. He could feel the rhythm inside him, and he found comfort in singing. It helped him deal with the loneliness he felt after leaving India and the pressures of post-war life. Slowly, music began shaping his identity. He would practice at home, imitate the singers he admired, and imagine himself performing in front of others. His confidence grew, and he started showing his talent to friends, who encouraged him to pursue it further. His passion for music soon led him to gather a few friends who shared the same excitement for rock and roll. They formed a small band, first calling themselves the Drifters. The group practiced whenever they had free time, using simple equipment and focusing mostly on American songs they loved. For Cliff, performing with a band gave him the sense of belonging he had been missing since moving from India. It was the first time he felt like he had a real purpose, something that made him feel grounded and happy. As they played together, they dreamed of bigger stages, unaware that those dreams were much closer to reality than they imagined. The Drifters eventually renamed themselves the Shadows, and this early group would later become a major part of Cliff's rise to fame. But in these early years, they were just a bunch of determined teenagers trying to follow the sound that had captured their hearts. Cliff's voice stood out because it carried emotion, energy, and a natural smoothness that listeners immediately connected with. Even before he was discovered, people around him sensed that he had something special, something different, that could take him far if given the chance. What made this period important was not success, but transformation. Cliff had gone from a lonely boy in a strange country to a young man with a clear direction in life. Music gave him comfort, confidence, and a sense of identity. It helped him forget the struggles of post-war Britain and the feeling of displacement from leaving India. Whenever he sang or performed with his band, he felt free. The dullness of daily life faded away, replaced by the energy and excitement of rock and roll. These teenage years laid the foundation for everything Cliff Richard would later achieve. They shaped his character, his discipline, and his musical style. They also connected him to the early movement that would eventually become the backbone of British rock and roll. He was still far from fame, but the spark had already been lit. He had no idea that just a few years later, a single song and a single night would change British music forever. Before the Beatles, before the British invasion, there was one voice that cracked open the door and changed the direction of British music. By 1958, Cliff Richard was still a young man with big dreams, but he didn't know that he was about to become the face of a musical shift that the country had never seen before. The idea for the song Move It came during a time when rock and roll was exploding in America, but barely existed in the United Kingdom. British music was still mostly pop ballads, dance tunes, and polite melodies. Nothing had the sharp, raw sound that young people wanted. Cliff, who had grown up listening to Elvis Presley and Little Richard, felt strongly that the UK needed a song with the same energy. That desire pushed him and his band to create something bold and different, Move. It was written by Ian Samwell, who was part of Cliff's early circle. The moment Cliff heard the tune, he knew the song had something special. It had a beat that felt alive, a rhythm that made people want to move, and a style that Britain wasn't used to. They recorded the song with simple tools and limited experience, but what it lacked in polish, it made up for in spirit. Cliff sang with confidence and energy, and the music behind him matched the excitement of American rock and roll. When Move It was recorded, none of them expected it to become a historic moment. They were simply trying to create a song that felt real to them. When the track was released later in 1958, it hit Britain like a shockwave. People were surprised to hear a British singer who sounded fresh, youthful, and full of attitude. Young listeners finally heard a voice that spoke to their generation. Older listeners were unsure of what to make of it, but the excitement was impossible to ignore. The song quickly climbed the charts, reaching the top 3 in the UK. Listeners kept saying the same thing: this is the first real British rock and roll record. For Cliff, it felt like a dream coming true. He had admired Elvis for years, and now people were calling him the British Elvis. It was a title he didn't expect, but it made him feel like he had finally found his place. The success of Move It brought attention not only to Cliff, but also to his band. The Drifters, soon to be renamed The Shadows to avoid conflict with an American group, became a key part of his sound. The Shadows quickly proved that they were more than just a backing group. Their instrumental style had a clear, clean sound that would later influence dozens of musicians. The guitar work of Hank Marvin became one of the most recognizable sounds of early British rock. The Shadows' skill made Cliff's performances stronger, and together they created a style that many future bands would follow. As Move It gained momentum, Cliff's popularity grew at a speed he didn't expect. Concerts became louder, crowded, and full of young people who had finally found an artist that represented their feelings. Teenagers. Who? He felt restricted by the strictness of post-war life, connected with Cliff's energy and confidence. His look, his voice, and his stage presence gave them a sense of freedom. Youth culture in Britain was changing, and Cliff was becoming its symbol. He wasn't trying to start a revolution, but his music became the soundtrack of a new teenage identity that wanted independence, excitement, and self-expression. Early television appearances also played a big role in his sudden rise. When Cliff appeared on TV, audiences saw a young man who sounded different and looked different. He didn't stand still like singers from the older generation. He moved with the rhythm, smiled naturally, and connected with the camera in a way that felt modern and fresh. These performances caused even more excitement, and fan hysteria grew quickly. Girls screamed his name, fans filled concert halls, and crowds waited outside venues just to get a glimpse of him. It was the beginning of pop star culture in Britain. As the months passed, Cliff found himself becoming a national icon. He was no longer just a teenager with a dream. He was now recognized as the first true British rock star. The press wrote about him constantly. Music shows invited him regularly, and young bands began copying his style. British music executives, who had previously ignored rock and roll, finally understood they needed to support this new movement. Cliff's success opened the door for other artists, proving that British rock could stand on its own. The music industry started to invest in young talent, realizing there was a huge audience waiting for music that felt real and exciting. But Cliff's rapid rise also came with pressure. Being called the UK's answer to Elvis was flattering, but it also placed a heavy weight on his shoulders. He knew that people expected him to represent the new sound of Britain. He understood that one mistake could break the trust of fans who had embraced him so quickly. Still, he stayed focused, kept practicing, and worked hard to improve his performances. The success of Move It validated his belief that he could make a career out of music. It showed him that his instincts were right, and that there was a space for him in the world of rock and roll. Through this time, Cliff formed a strong bond with his fans. They supported him passionately, and he felt grateful for their love. He tried his best to stay humble despite the growing fame. The connection between Cliff and his audience was special, because many of them saw their own struggles and dreams reflected in him. He had come from a working-class background, faced challenges, and still managed to make it. His story gave them hope during a time when life was difficult for many families in Britain. By the end of 1958, Cliff Richard was no longer just a rising star. He had become the face of a new musical era. His voice, his songs, and the power of Move It had awakened something in the British music scene. Producers were now looking for the next big talent, and young musicians across the country felt inspired to start bands. Cliff had unknowingly begun a spark that others would soon turn into a wildfire. But while Cliff was rising, something else was quietly forming, and its arrival would change everything. Long before they met, Cliff Richard unknowingly shaped the band that would one day reshape the world. In the late 1952, when Cliff was already becoming a star, 4 young boys in Liverpool were just beginning to discover music in a serious way. These boys would later become the Beatles, but at this point, they were simply teenagers trying to learn instruments, copy their heroes, and find a sound that felt right to them. Liverpool was full of small clubs, dance halls, and makeshift stages where young musicians gathered to practice. It was in this atmosphere that John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and later Ringo Starr slowly came together. They listened to American rock and roll, tried to learn guitar riffs by ear, and spent hours practicing until their fingers hurt. They admired many artists, but one name stood out more than others in those early days: Cliff Richard. Cliff's success with Move It hit them at a time when they were still forming their identity. For young George Harrison, Cliff represented something new and exciting. George was shy by nature, more reserved than John or Paul, but he had a deep hunger to learn guitar and understand music. When he saw Cliff rising so quickly, he paid attention. Cliff was young, British, confident, and performing the kind of music George wanted to master. George admired Cliff's stage presence and the smooth, clear voice that had captured the country, but he also admired Cliff's band, the Shadows. The Shadows were skilled musicians, especially guitarist Hank Marvin. George studied Marvin's guitar style carefully, trying to copy the clean sound and precise playing. Many young guitarists of that time saw the Shadows as the standard they needed to reach, and George was one of them. In the early 1960 seconds, industry people often compared every new act to Cliff Richard. Cliff was seen as the #1 British star, the person everyone else had to compete with. Music executives and journalists would ask, "Can this band be as big as Cliff? Or do they have the talent to challenge Cliff's place?" This created a certain pressure in the industry. Cliff had set a high bar, and anyone who came after him needed to prove they could match or surpass his success. The Beatles, still unknown at the time, were aware of this. They knew Cliff was the one to beat. His popularity, clean-cut charm, and strong fan base made him seem untouchable. But the Beatles were aiming to create something different. Their sound was raw, energetic, and full of personality. While Cliff represented stability and polish, the Beatles had a more rebellious, unfiltered edge. The difference in their images was clear even before the Beatles gained fame. Cliff wore stylish clothes, kept his hair tidy, and had a wholesome presence that appealed to families as well as teenagers. His songs were catchy but safe, and his public behavior reinforced his clean reputation. The Beatles, especially in their early club days, were wilder, more playful, and not afraid to push boundaries. They joked on stage, moved freely, and played with a rougher, more urgent sound. Yet, despite these differences, the Beatles still respected what Cliff had achieved. They saw him as the pioneer who had opened the door for British rock artists, and without him, their own path might have been harder. When the Beatles finally began getting attention, Cliff noticed them too. He had already been famous for a few years, so he paid attention to rising acts. The first time Cliff saw the Beatles perform, he felt they had something that most bands did not. He sensed the natural chemistry between John, Paul, and George. Even though their style was different from his, he understood they had potential. He wasn't jealous or threatened. Instead, he was impressed by their energy and natural confidence. Cliff later said that he knew they would go far because they had a spark that couldn't be taught. Their first backstage encounter happened when the Beatles were still climbing toward fame. Cliff remembered seeing George standing slightly behind the others, quiet and observant. While John and Paul talked easily, George stayed polite and calm. Cliff noticed George's shyness immediately. He had seen the same kind of quiet seriousness in many young musicians who were deeply passionate about their craft. George didn't speak much, but when Cliff caught his eyes, he sensed something thoughtful and sincere. There was no arrogance in George, only respect. George admired Cliff's early work, but never tried to show off or act like he knew more than he did. That humility made him stand out. During these the moments, Cliff saw hints of what George would become. There was a gentleness and a depth to him that felt unusual for someone so young. Cliff later admitted that he felt an instant connection to George, even if their conversation was brief. He could see that George cared deeply about music, not fame. That sincerity made Cliff remember him long after the meeting. As the Beatles gained popularity, industry talk grew louder. People wondered if the Beatles would survive alongside Cliff's huge success. Some radio hosts asked openly, "Will this new band take over, or will Cliff stay on top?" Fans debated too. Older fans stayed loyal to Cliff, while younger ones were excited by the Beatles' bold new sound. There was no real rivalry between them, but the media loved creating these comparisons. Cliff never encouraged it. He believed there was room for everyone, and he respected the Beatles' talent. As the 1960 seconds continued, Cliff and the Beatles lived through the same cultural wave, though from different angles. Cliff was already established, navigating fame with experience. The Beatles were rising fast, learning how to handle the madness of Beatlemania. Both were shaping British music, one as a pioneer and the other as a revolution. They existed side by side, connected by the same movement even before their personal friendship truly began. Through all these changes, one thing remained constant: George Harrison's quiet respect for Cliff and Cliff's gentle appreciation for the Beatles' creativity. Their bond had started long before they spoke more deeply, rooted in shared passion and mutual admiration. But no one, not Cliff, not George, knew how much their paths would intertwine in the years ahead. Fame builds legends, but faith builds men. By the mid-1960s, Cliff Richard had already become one of Britain's most famous performers. Yet something inside him was shifting. The loud rock and roll energy that had defined his early career was slowly giving way to a softer, more thoughtful style. Music trends around the world were changing, and Cliff felt the need to adapt in a way that still felt true to him. This led him toward gentler pop songs that showed a different side of his voice and personality. Instead of relying on the raw excitement of rock and roll, he began focusing more on melody and emotion. His popularity remained strong, but people could see that he was entering a new phase in his musical life. One of the most memorable moments of this period was Cliff's performance of Congratulations at the Eurovision Song Contest in 1968. The song was fun, bright, and catchy, and Cliff delivered it with confidence and charm. Although he finished in second place, the song became a huge hit across Europe and even beyond. It confirmed that Cliff could reach audiences of all ages, not just teenagers. Congratulations became one of his signature songs and showed that he could still dominate the charts even as music changed around him. For Cliff, Eurovision wasn't just a performance, it was proof that his shift toward lighter pop music was working. But while his public life looked successful and stable, something much deeper was happening inside him. The constant pressure of fame and the fast pace of the music world made him think more about his personal beliefs and values. He started asking himself bigger questions about life, purpose, and the direction he wanted to follow. This inner search led him toward Christianity in a serious and committed way. His spiritual longing grew stronger, and he began reading more, meeting people who shared their faith, experiences, and attending gatherings that helped him understand his own beliefs. Eventually, he experienced a personal Christian conversion, something that changed not just his mindset, but the entire direction of his future. Faith became the anchor that grounded him. Cliff often said that becoming a Christian did not take him away from music, but it gave him a new reason to sing. It softened his heart, reduced his stress, and helped him stay focused on what mattered most. While many celebrities were getting caught up in drugs, scandals, and reckless behavior, Cliff took a different path. He avoided situations that could damage him emotionally or spiritually, choosing instead to surround himself with good influences and meaningful routines. This helped him maintain a long and clean career in an industry where many struggled to stay stable. Even though Cliff became more private and careful, his career did not suffer. In fact, the opposite happened. During the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, he experienced a major resurgence that introduced him to a whole new generation of fans. Songs like Devil Woman, We Don't Talk Anymore, and Dreaming became huge hits. Each one showed a different style, proving that Cliff knew how to reinvent himself again and again. Devil Woman had a darker, mysterious vibe. We Don't Talk Anymore had a modern, polished sound that fit perfectly with the late 70 seconds. And Dreaming gave listeners a warm, emotional melody that highlighted the strength of his voice. This era of hits showed that Cliff was not fading, he was growing. Reinvention is not easy for any artist, but Cliff managed it without losing his identity. He never tried to shock the public or chase trends that didn't match his character. Instead, he allowed his music to evolve naturally. His fans respected him for staying honest, and new listeners appreciated his ability to adapt without pretending to be someone he wasn't. It was this balance, changing enough to stay fresh, but not so much that he lost himself, that kept him relevant for so many years. Through all the ups and downs of the industry, Cliff continued to avoid the destructive behaviors that impacted many musicians. The 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds were full of stories about artists losing control due to fame, stress, and pressure. But Cliff's faith and self-discipline protected him. There were times when he felt isolated because of the choices he made, especially when people expected him to live the wild lifestyle of a celebrity. However, he believed strongly in maintaining a life that honored his values, even if it meant standing apart from others. This isolation didn't weaken him, it strengthened him. He often said that he felt guided and protected, even when he was unsure of what would come next. The public noticed his clean record and respected him even more for it. Cliff became known not only for his music, but also for his integrity. Parents trusted him, fans admired him, and even people who didn't listen to his music viewed him as a positive role model. In an industry where scandals were common, Cliff's steady behavior made him stand out. His moral compass became as much a part of his identity as his voice. People saw him as someone who could be successful without compromising his principles, and this earned him long-term loyalty from millions. Even with all his personality accomplishments, Cliff continued to search for deeper meaning in his life. Fame gave him opportunities, but it didn't fill the questions in his heart. His spiritual journey brought him comfort, yet he knew there was still more to learn about himself and the world. He had to balance the joy of performing with the responsibility of staying true to his beliefs. This balancing act shaped him into a unique figure in entertainment, an artist who cared as much about his inner life as his public image. As Cliff moved forward, he wasn't only becoming a stronger performer, he was becoming a stronger person. His choices were guided by faith, not fame. His reinvention came from honesty, not pressure. And his success came from resilience, not luck. But Cliff wasn't the only one searching. George Harrison was on his own spiritual journey, from a very different direction. To understand the truth, Cliff reveals, we must first understand the man George Harrison became and why his silence was louder than fame. George's journey was unlike any other member of the Beatles. While John and Paul were often in the spotlight as the main songwriters, George quietly grew and evolved in the background, slowly becoming a deep thinker, a spiritual seeker, and an artist who wanted more from life than applause. When the Beatles first formed, George was the youngest member, only a teenager with a strong interest in guitar. He practiced endlessly, studying his instrument with care and patience. As the band developed, George's musical ideas became more important, and he slowly found his own voice within the group. But even during their rise, he always seemed more thoughtful and reserved compared to the others. As the Beatles' fame exploded, George became more aware of how stressful and overwhelming life at the top could be. Beatlemania was intense, with thousands of fans screaming, crowds chasing them, and constant media attention. While John and Paul could sometimes enjoy the madness, George found it exhausting and confusing. He once said that Beatlemania felt like losing control of his life. Everywhere he went, he was recognized. Every decision was watched. Every word was repeated. He felt as if the world was taking more from him than it was giving. Fame made him question what truly mattered. This desire to understand himself and find meaning led him to explore something far beyond music. George's interest in Indian culture began during the mid-1960 seconds. He heard the sitar during the filming of Help and felt something shift inside him. The sound touched him in a way that Western music did not. It felt spiritual, calming, and full of depth. This discovery led him to meet Ravi Shankar, the famous Indian musician who later became George's mentor and friend. Ravi taught him the sitar and opened the door to Indian philosophy, meditation, and a new way of looking at life. George became deeply involved with spirituality, especially the teachings linked to Krishna devotion. Meditation became part of his daily routine, and he studied sacred texts with sincere interest. This spiritual intensity changed George not only as a musician, but as a person. He no longer cared about fame in the way others did. He wanted peace, quiet, and time to understand himself. While the Beatles were touring, performing, and recording non-stop, George felt more and more disconnected from the pressure. He still loved music, but he needed something more than success. His yearning for inner peace grew stronger each year, and it became clear that he was searching for something that fame could never give him. As the Beatles moved into their later period, George began contributing more songs that reflected his new mindset. Tracks like Within You, Without You, and Here Comes the Sun showed his longing for calm, clarity, and a deeper connection to life. His lyrics were filled with messages about the mind, the soul, and the need to look beyond material things. Even though he didn't always get the same spotlight as John or Paul, George's music carried a quiet power. Many fans around the world connected deeply with his words because they felt honest and comforting. After the Beatles broke up, George continued to follow his spiritual path. His first major solo project, All Things Must Pass, became one of the most respected albums in rock history. It showed his maturity, his emotional depth, and his ability to create music that spoke to the heart. George didn't chase fame during his solo career. He didn't like public pressure, and he preferred working privately or with close friends. He spent a lot of time in his garden, practicing meditation and enjoying ordinary life. His home became his sanctuary. He also stayed active in spiritual causes, especially through the Hare Krishna movement, which he supported quietly but consistently. His work went beyond music. He helped raise awareness for global issues and became a bridge between Western audiences and Eastern teachings. Throughout these years, Cliff Richard watched George from afar. Cliff admired George's devotion to inner peace and the natural calm he carried with him. Even though they came from different religious backgrounds, Cliff respected the seriousness of George's spiritual commitment. Cliff often felt drawn to people who were sincere and grounded, and George showed that quality in everything he did. George, on the other hand, respected Cliff's clean image and strong faith, even though their paths were very different. To George, Cliff represented discipline, positivity, and a willingness to live according to personal belief rather than the pressures of fame. Their mutual respect was not loud or dramatic. It grew slowly, almost silently, as they observed each other's values from a distance. Both men were searching for something beyond fame. Both felt the weight of public expectations, and both understood that happiness comes from the soul, not the spotlight. George's calm presence made Cliff curious. Cliff's faith made George thoughtful. They were different, yet connected by the same desire for truth. George's journey showed that he was far more than the quiet Beatle. His silence was not emptiness, it was focus. His calm was not weakness, it was strength. And his spiritual path was not an escape, it was a home he built inside himself. This was the man Cliff would later speak about with such emotion. This was the man whose influence touched countless people, not through noise, but through depth. And then, one quiet meeting in Liverpool would begin a friendship that lasted a lifetime. This was no ordinary friendship, it was two men from opposite worlds discovering the same questions. When Cliff Richard and George Harrison first met backstage in the early 1960 seconds, neither of them expected that their quiet conversations would stay with them for the rest of their lives. At first, their meetings were brief. They would greet each other politely, share a few words about music or touring, and then move on to their own schedules. But something about their personalities made these small exchanges feel meaningful. Cliff noticed George's calmness immediately. Even though he was young and rising fast in the music world, George carried a peaceful energy that felt rare. George, on the other hand, admired Cliff's steady presence and strong moral foundation. It didn't take long before the two men began talking about deeper subjects. Their real friendship grew during private moments backstage, away from cameras and loud crowds. These spaces were quiet, usually filled with soft murmurs from band members tuning instruments or stage crew preparing equipment. Cliff and George would often find a corner where they could sit, relax, and talk openly. Their conversations started with ordinary topics, music, travel, or the stress of constant touring, but soon turned into discussions about life, faith, and purpose. Cliff spoke from his Christian perspective, sharing how his belief in God guided him, especially during moments when fame felt overwhelming. He told George how prayer gave him strength, and how reading the Bible helped him stay grounded in a world that could easily pull someone off track. George listened with interest, but his own spiritual journey was very different. He talked about his attraction to Indian philosophy and meditation. He explained the teachings he had learned from Ravi Shankar and shared how Eastern beliefs helped him understand life beyond material success. Unlike many musicians who only cared about hits and charts, George cared deeply about the soul. He believed that the world was full of noise and true peace could only come from within. His words were simple but carried great depth, and Cliff felt that George spoke with genuine experience, not just theory. One day, during one of their quiet conversations, George said something that stayed with Cliff forever. Cliff had been talking about how different their religions were and how people often argued about which path was the right one. George smiled gently and replied, "All paths lead to the same place if your heart is right." Cliff later said that this one sentence touched him deeply. It wasn't about comparing beliefs or trying to prove one better than the other. It was about sincerity, love, and the intention of the heart. Cliff admired how George could express such wisdom with so few words. What made their friendship unique was the respect they had for each other's beliefs. They didn't debate or argue. There was no need to convince one another. Instead, they listened, learned, and appreciated the different ways they were trying to understand life. Both men were searching for truth, but they came from different directions. Cliff followed the teachings of Christianity, while George explored Hinduism and Eastern philosophy. Yet, despite this difference, they recognized the same longing in each other, the longing for peace, purpose, and a deeper connection to something greater. Their conversations also touched on the pressures of fame. George often spoke about the stress of being a Beatle, the non-stop attention, and the feeling of being trapped by public expectations. Cliff understood these struggles well. Even though he maintained a cleaner, calmer image, he also felt the weight of needing to stay strong for his fans. They talked about how fame could lift a person, but also burden them. George told Cliff that fame had made him look inward, searching for the meaning behind everything. Cliff shared how fame had pushed him toward faith, wanting to stay grounded and humble. These emotional exchanges helped both of them feel understood in a way that few people could offer. Cliff found comfort in talking to George because George never judged him. George's quiet wisdom made Cliff feel seen, valued, and respected. In a world filled with loud voices and strong opinions, George spoke softly, yet impactfully. Cliff later said that George had a gift for making you think without making you feel pressured. George would talk about letting go of ego, understanding the temporary nature of life, and focusing on inner peace. These ideas slowly shaped the way Cliff viewed his own music and choices. Over time, Cliff realized that his later songs became more personal and spiritual because of the influence George had on him. Their conversations opened his mind and helped him explore themes he may not have considered before. Even though their faiths were different, the emotional honesty in their talks encouraged Cliff to approach his music with more reflection and sincerity. He began to see that music could touch the soul, not just entertain. As the years went on, their friendship remained quiet but true. They did not see each other often, but whenever they met, the connection felt familiar and meaningful. The admiration between them grew silently. Cliff admired George's courage to walk a spiritual path, even when the world expected him to be a typical rock star. George admired Cliff's dedication to faith in an industry full of temptations and distractions. Their friendship was built on honesty, respect, and a shared understanding that life was about more than fame. In the music world, it was rare to find two artists who could talk so openly about God, peace, and the soul. Their conversations were private treasures, moments where they could both be themselves without the pressure of their careers. George's words lingered in Cliff's mind long after their talks ended, especially the idea that the heart was what truly mattered. Cliff carried that message with him throughout his life. Yet Cliff never knew how much George's final years would change the way he remembered him. Some friendships don't need daily presence, only genuine connection. As the years went on, George Harrison slowly stepped away from the noise of fame and moved toward a life built on peace, family, and the simple joy of being at home. After the intense years of the Beatles and the early rush of his solo career, George found comfort in gardening, spending time in nature, and enjoying quiet moments with the people he loved. His home in Friar Park became his personal sanctuary, a place where he could walk barefoot in the grass, plant flowers, or sit with a cup of tea and feel completely at ease. Gardening became more than a hobby for him. It became a form of meditation, a way to feel grounded and connected to the world without the stress of public attention. The man who once stood in front of millions now found happiness in seeds, soil, and silence. Cliff Richard watched this transformation from a distance. Their lives were very different, and their careers took them in separate directions. But Cliff always paid attention to George's journey. He admired how George had the courage to step away from fame at a time when most people would cling to it. Cliff continued performing and recording, moving comfortably in the public eye. But he respected George's decision to choose peace over pressure. Cliff once said that George had a special kind of bravery, the bravery to walk away from the world's expectations and follow his heart. Even though they weren't close in the traditional sense, Cliff felt connected to George through their shared search for meaning. Their paths would cross occasionally at charity events or industry gatherings. These reunions were always warm, filled with gentle smiles and quiet conversations. Cliff cherished these moments because they reminded him of the deep talks they once shared. He especially remembered one evening when George took out his sitar and played for a small group of friends. There was no stage, no performance lights, no cameras, just George, sitting calmly in a corner with the instrument on his lap. The sound was soft and spiritual, filling the Blowjile Blends to Oscillations room with a peaceful energy. Cliff felt completely moved by it. He said it was one of the most sincere musical moments he had ever witnessed, not because of the skill, but because of the emotion behind it. George wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was sharing a part of his soul. As the 1,990 seconds passed, George continued living quietly, focusing on his garden, his family, and the spiritual practices that had guided him for decades. Cliff continued performing, touring, and recording. Their lives were different, but Cliff often thought about George's peaceful lifestyle. He admired how George didn't let fame control him. George knew how to step away, breathe, and protect his inner life. Cliff sometimes wondered if he himself could ever do that. He loved his fans, his concerts, and the energy of performing, but he felt a small sense of envy to admiration mixed with longing for the peace George had found. In late 2001, the news that George Harrison had passed away shocked Cliff deeply. Even though they hadn't been in constant contact, Cliff felt the loss more strongly than he expected. When he heard the news, he had to sit down and let it sink in. It felt unreal that someone who had touched so many lives, someone who seemed to live with such calmness and wisdom, was suddenly gone. Cliff felt a wave of sadness, not just for George's family, but for the world. George had been more than a musician. He had been a quiet teacher to anyone who listened carefully. Cliff found himself thinking back to their conversations, especially the ones about life and purpose. He remembered George speaking about inner peace, about letting go of ego, and about finding truth in the heart rather than in achievements. These memories hit Cliff harder now that George was no longer alive. It made him realize how deeply George's presence had shaped him over the years. He had not fully understood it before, but now he saw it clearly. George had given him something that few people could, a different way of looking at life. Cliff regretted not spending more time with him, not having more conversations, not taking more chances to visit him or sit with him in peace the way George enjoyed. The regret was gentle, not painful, but it made Cliff reflect on how limited time really is. George's passing also made Cliff think about mortality, not just George's but his own. He was getting older too, and he wondered what kind of legacy he would leave behind. He thought about the kind of person he wanted to be remembered as, the values he wanted to stand for, and the impact he hoped to have on others. He realized that George was remembered not only for his music, but for his kindness, his humility, and his peaceful heart. For Cliff, this was a powerful lesson. It reminded him that success was important, but the soul of a person mattered far more. In the quiet moments after George's death, Cliff reflected on the beauty of their friendship. It was not a friendship based on frequent meetings or long dinners. It was a friendship built on honesty, respect, and shared spiritual questions. It was a connection of two men who came from different faiths but walked the same internal path toward truth. Cliff realized that George had been a quiet guide in his life, even from a distance. The influence wasn't loud or obvious, but it was real. As Cliff looked back, he felt grateful for every conversation, every smile, every moment that connected him to George. The loss hurt, but the lessons remained. They shaped him in ways he didn't understand until much later. And now, as Cliff aged and continued reflecting on his own life, he carried George's memory like a gentle reminder of what truly matters. But aging brings clarity, and Cliff's final truth about George is not what fans expect. It takes a lifetime to understand a person, and sometimes even longer to admit what they meant to you. Now, at 85, Cliff Richard speaks with a softness that only age can bring. His voice carries the weight of memories, the warmth of gratitude, and the honesty of someone who no longer needs to hide anything. He has lived through 6 decades of music, faith, and fame, but some stories stayed inside him for years. One of those stories is his quiet friendship with George Harrison. Cliff says he is finally ready to speak about it because time has helped him understand things he couldn't see clearly before. It isn't about creating headlines or surprising the world. It's about acknowledging what his heart has carried for so long. As Cliff looks back, he realizes that George was one of the most quietly spiritual people he ever met. He had seen many famous artists in his life, loud ones, wild ones, troubled ones, but George was different. He didn't preach, he didn't push his beliefs on others, and he didn't try to look wise. His calmness came from somewhere deep inside him, and it showed in the way he spoke, moved, and even stayed silent. Cliff remembers moments when George said very little, yet, somehow, those few words stayed with him for years. Cliff now understands that George lived his truth gently, without the need for attention, and that, Cliff says, was true spirituality. For the first time, Cliff admits that he envied something about George, not his fame, not his success, but his freedom. George had the courage to step away from the spotlight, to protect his peace, and to choose a life that made him happy, rather than a life that pleased others. Cliff loved performing too much to walk away from it, but he sometimes wondered what it would feel like to live like George did. Quietly, simply, away from pressure. Cliff says he admired how George could wake up in the morning, go into his garden, play his guitar under the trees, and feel completely content. That kind of peace felt rare, almost unreachable, for someone who spent most of life under public attention. Their friendship also taught Cliff humility. Even though Cliff had been a star before the Beatles, he never felt superior to George. Being around George made him think in a deeper way. George never acted like a legend or a hero. He behaved like an ordinary man, searching for meaning. Cliff says there was something humbling about seeing someone so famous live with such simplicity. It reminded him that fame is temporary, but the way a person lives and treats others is what stays. Cliff believes that knowing George made him a more thoughtful and grounded person. One of the greatest lessons George gave Cliff was understanding spirituality beyond labels. Cliff followed Christianity, and George followed Hindu philosophy, yet their conversations were filled with connection rather than conflict. George helped Cliff see that different beliefs can still lead to the same place if they're guided by sincerity. Cliff remembers how George once said, "All paths lead to the same place if your heart is right," and how those words opened something inside him. Cliff never tried to change George's beliefs, and George never questioned Cliff's faith. They respected each other completely. Cliff now says that this acceptance shaped the way he understands faith today. He sees spirituality not as a competition, but as a journey that every person walks in their own way. Cliff's admiration for George's authenticity only grew stronger over the years. George was not interested in pretending or playing a role. What you saw was who he truly was. Cliff says that kind of honesty is rare in show business. Many artists feel the need to act a certain way to stay relevant, but George never forced himself to be anything other than himself. Cliff loved that about him. He says George's honesty reminded him of what really matters: living in truth, staying humble, and keeping your soul intact. As Cliff reflects now, he sees their friendship as two men walking two different paths, but heading toward the same destination. They came from different backgrounds, held different beliefs, and lived different lives. Yet they shared the same questions about peace, purpose, and what it means to live fully. Cliff says that their connection was never loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and meaningful. It was the kind of bond that did not need constant contact to stay alive. At 85, Cliff speaks with gratitude. He is thankful for every conversation, every smile, every quiet moment shared with George. He is thankful for the lessons, the inspiration, and the gentle wisdom that George brought into his life. He says he finally understands how deeply George affected him, not through grand gestures but through presence. Cliff describes it as a bond that survives even in memory, a friendship that continues to guide him even now. The truth Cliff shares today isn't a secret or a scandal. It's wisdom born from age, the kind that comes when a person looks back with clear eyes and an open heart. It is the truth of admiration, reflection, and peace. Cliff says that speaking about George now feels like finally saying what needed to be said, something he had carried quietly for years. His voice shakes a little when he talks about George, not from sadness but from respect and love. In the end, Cliff's message is simple but powerful. He believes that friendships like his with George remind us that life is about connection, understanding, and the courage to seek inner peace. He believes that spiritual truth comes from kindness and openness, not from fear or judgment, and he believes that the people who touch our souls stay with us forever, even long after they're gone. And the question Cliff now asks and leaves us with is one only age can teach.